Thank you all for coming today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kate Miller, your Dean of Friendly Neighborhood, Dean of Geosciences. And I'm really happy to be here. Pleased to introduce two people who are visiting from the National Science Foundation. And I'm going to start with Rick Murray here, who's the director of the Ocean Sciences Division. He's doing this directorship on a rotator basis from his position as a professor at Boston University, and he has done lots of work in marine geochemical cycling, paleoceanography, and climate evolution, and he's very experienced out on our JOIDES resolution ship, among many other research ships he's been out on as a scientist. Wanted to mention that Rick will also be here tomorrow, and in room 602 in O&M he'll be giving a talk mainly geared towards ocean kinds of things between 8:30 and 9:30. Have a Q&A, and then from 9:30 to 10:30 he's happy to meet with early career scientists, postdocs, assistant professors, research scientists. Please feel welcome to 602 tomorrow if you're interested in talking with Rick. And by the way, it's always a good idea to talk to your directors at NSF to get to know them, so they know you. Put a face to a name. And so now I want to introduce our speaker, who is Roger Wakimoto, who is the assistant director for the director of Geosciences at NSF. So he's number two to the director of the National Science Foundation, and he is the one who's funds ultimately responsible for so much of the funding that we get here. Before Roger was at NSF, he was at NCAR for a number of years, finally as director for the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, and before that he was at UCLA as a professor and department head. His interest is severe weather for research, tornadoes, thunderstorms, and anything else you can think of there. So I know we have a Storm Chasers Club, so I guess they're in your bailiwick. And he's going to talk to us today about a variety of activities and forward-thinking things of what's going on in the Geosciences Director at NSF. So, Roger.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I have to tell you, when I talk to larger audience, I'm much more comfortable giving scientific presentations. Less so, I guess, giving administrative ones. But we'll see. We'll see if this covers all the things you would hope I talk about. And remember that Rick is talking tomorrow, so if you have difficult questions, please defer them tomorrow morning. Now, you don't have to ask me now. You can ask Rick later. In the Directorate of Geosciences, we have 4 divisions, and these are the 4 divisions: Ocean Sciences, Polar Programs, Atmospheric and Geospace Sciences, and Earth Sciences. Another little tidbit, we have 7 directorates, and I have the next slide to give you a little bit more insight. We tend to be neck and neck with Math and Physical Sciences Directorate as the largest directorates in terms of funding. NSF as a whole is about $7 billion, and MPS, Math and Physical Sciences, and Geo each have about $1.3 billion. And the reason why is because we tend to be the 2 directorates that are dominated by facilities. It may be obvious for Geo, ships and other things. For Math and Physical Sciences, you may have to pause a little bit, but then you understand, all I need to tell you is that's where the Division of Astronomy is. And they have huge telescopes. And of course, as you've been following the news, it was Math and Physical Sciences that were in the headlines because they funded LIGO, which discovered the gravitational waves. So, of course, my colleague in MPS is ecstatic about that.
And they had to use seismometers to help solve the
I thought I would share with you my very close friends and colleagues. These are the ADs, or assistant directors, in the other directorates. I already mentioned MPS, that's Fleming Krim, but you may know SBE with Faye Cook. Pramod Kakanagar is the engineer director. Joan Ferrini-Money is EHR Education. Jim Carosi is SCIENCE, the Computer and Information Science and Engineering Director. And Jim Olds is the Biological Sciences AD. Well, I did some detective work, and for fiscal year 15, and it does change, these numbers move around, but I thought you'd like to see just a snapshot of the top 20, I won't say just universities, there are a couple organizations in there, in terms of just dollar amount, where did the money go from NSF? I highlighted number 1 and 3 because those are Geosciences ones. Lockheed Martin might be really strange to you, like to say, why are we funding Lockheed Martin? But they're the ones that provide all the logistical support for the Antarctic. And that is not easy. They fund all the aircraft that transports equipment and scientists back and forth. They fund all the transport that occurs on the Antarctic, and that is non-trivial. You might know about the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. That actually oversees NCAR, which Kate mentioned in her introductory comment. They receive a huge chunk of money, too. The other thing I'll mention is University of Illinois. You might wonder why they're number 2. It's largely because that's where one of the supercomputers is housed. And so that is not cheap either. And then you can go through the rest. Most of the rest that's just the amount of grant money basically that they get. So where does Texas A&M stand on this? I did more detective work. I realized you actually have 2 line items. One is the Research Foundation and then the main campus. So when you actually add those 2 together, you come out pretty well, actually, number 28. So that's very good. Of course, of that 48 in the Research Foundation, I think you're maybe familiar, a fraction of this audience is familiar, a lot of that goes to the drilling program. Huge component. I won't break it down any more than that, other than to tell you that you need Geosciences because of this total from here. This is how it sort of breaks out in terms of the top 2. I'm always curious about this when I visit universities. We give you the bulk of it, 52.9 million, and the Math and Physical Sciences Directorate gives you 7, and then I didn't list the others. But you can sort of add that up to see that these 2 directorates provide the lion's share. Very briefly, I'll just tell you that when I got there was so much going on at the Geosciences Directorate, and at the time I was there, budgets were kind of flat. They've continued to be flat, if not declining slightly because in real dollars. I just want to mention that I thought it was really important to go through a strategic planning exercise. I believe in it very strongly. I've gone through at least 3 or 4 of these. And without going through details of exactly what we said, I do have the web link down there. You could also just Google it and you'll get it. I think we did come up with a real good plan that sort of provided a roadmap of my first 3 years as the AD for Geosciences in terms of what we needed to do and what we needed to make sure the community knew the directions we were going. Because I don't want the community to be surprised when we put out a new initiative or go in a particular direction that you were involved with this. We got lots of community input. Many of you maybe provided some of that input that we responded to before we came up with this final document. So I think it's great to do a strategic plan when budgets are good, but I actually personally believe it's absolutely critical when budgets are a little tight because you need to be very strategic in terms of where your investments are going to go. I want to hit a little bit about OCE, but I'm going to hit a lot of subjects. I want to go into some overview, but I know Rick is going to talk about this more tomorrow because he's going to focus in on the Division of Ocean Sciences. But to let you know that they're in Ocean Sciences, in terms of facilities, it's big time in Ocean Sciences, and these really are the 3 big pillars. One is the academic research fleet, basically the ships that are out there. RCRV stands for Regional Class Research Vessels. Here at Texas A&M, everybody knows about the drilling program, and that is really important at the foundation and in Ocean Sciences. And lastly, this one that just essentially went online in December, that's the Oceans Observatory Initiative. Very cleverly, it went away from ships, which has sort of been the pillar of Ocean Sciences, and talked about a network of sensors, essentially over most of the globe, in certain strategic locations, continually measuring what was going on the ocean surfaces down to the seafloor. And when you have flat budgets, this statement won't surprise you. Anyone that's ever supported facilities or infrastructure knows that when you have flat budgets, it really can be a struggle to maintain that infrastructure and not eat away at the science budget. And I know the community of principal investigators and scientists, not just in ocean sciences, but other divisions, were very concerned because were we going to protect the infrastructure and then cut into the sort of grant program, which keeps many of you alive? This was such a serious problem that, or at least a serious issue, that what we did and I finally signed off on, we actually did a decadal survey. We asked the National Academy to come in and do a decadal survey about where you should go in ocean sciences. And once again, I'm not going to go into details because Rick will go through it. But I want to mention a couple things about this decadal survey. Decadal surveys are actually, almost up to the time we did this, was almost entirely under the purview of NASA. NASA, if you ever do a Google search of decadal surveys, NASA comes up all the time. They do it for telescopes, they do it for everything that's under their umbrella. Earth Sciences, there's one right now going on Earth Sciences. Where should NASA go in Earth Sciences? This is the first decadal survey that NASA had nothing to do with. So we were going into somewhat uncharted area. Plus, maybe the other thing I'll say, this is the first time Ocean Sciences ever did something like this. So there was a lot of trepidation whether, faculty and scientists in general tend to be fairly autonomous, and telling us that a group's going to come in and tell you where we should go in terms of priorities made them a lot nervous. And I got a lot of emails about that. How do you know this is going to come out right? How do you know that this isn't really going to turn the world upside down? To make a long story short, no one is ever completely happy. But by and large, this has been embraced by the community. Maybe more importantly, it's been embraced by my director. It's been embraced by the National Science Board that oversees the foundation. And almost everybody on the Hill. In other words, it's gotten bipartisan support, which is really important for us. It's gotten OMB and OSTP support all the way down the road. And this was all the things that sort of slightly kept me up at night. Nothing really keeps me up at night, but this one did a little bit. But it all turned out, I think, very well. It basically did a very nice balancing of those three major facilities in terms of slight cuts here and there to sort of stabilize the grant program. Again, I'll sort of let Rick talk about that tomorrow more broadly. I was really surprised by this. In 10 days, there were 3,000 downloads. And most Academy reports nobody reads. This is 3,000 downloads. And I want to clarify, that wasn't me pushing the button 2,000 just to make it go up. But it turned out to be number 12 last year. And why that's worth mentioning is most of the other ones that are above us are sort of in the health sciences, and that community is enormous. So it's not surprising. Relatively speaking, geosciences is not a huge community. So to be in the top 12 of NRC reports is actually a huge benchmark. And this was the final download total, about 8,000. And it was international too. It wasn't just the US. We had lots of downloads from other countries because we do fund a lot of international science. Drilling program's a good example. Again, I just want to show a picture without going through much detail. This is just OOI. Perhaps the only thing I wanted to mention is that you can see, I think, from that figure, even from the back of the room, where the sensors are underneath the ocean. They're all cabled. They're all running in real time. We're really excited about this. It was a little late in delivery. This was what we call an MREFC project. These are these huge projects. That stands for Major Research Equipment and Facility Construction Project. But it was on budget. It's already gotten wonderful data. It captured a volcano eruption. It censored around the volcano that in fact did erupt. And I know the scientists were just going through the roof about that. Also captured some earthquakes, underground earthquakes. And really doing it in a way you couldn't do before, because with ships, you only get snapshots. Here, this is continuous monitoring, which is new for the community. And this is one that I'm particularly happy about, although I did put a question. In other words, is this going to be another major research equipment facility and construction project? And what am I talking about? This is something else that sort of happened to me. Besides, ocean sciences was not the only problem I had to run into. This got thrown on my desk on I think the second week. This Blue Ribbon panel report that was looking at infrastructure in the Antarctic, and we really have by far the largest footprint there in terms of buildings and infrastructure that support scientists across the world. And maybe this was the most important statement from this Blue Ribbon panel report that you can read by yourself. But they basically said that the infrastructure was falling apart, and I needed to do something about it. This is great when you're still unpacking your bags to try to figure out what are you going to do about this. And I should also tell you a little history lesson. When McMurdo Station and Palmer Pier and all these were sort of being put together down in Antarctic, they were only supposed to last a few years. So you can sort of see the problem we had. They didn't think about decades-long support, which is really what it's been. It's hard to believe that they only put those buildings up. They say, oh, we only need to make sure they work for a few years. So it's, I think, been a remarkable success story that we've kept them running for decades. But now we've reached the limit. If you ever get a chance to go to the Antarctic, I would. It's really what I would call a life-changing experience. It's like you're in another world. And maybe a few, has anybody been to the Antarctic? Yeah, I mean, you know what I'm talking about. It's like you're in another world. That's one of the perks I get as AD at Geo. I get to go down and spend a week down at Wakimoto. So what did we do? Well, I had many discussions with the Division of Polar Programs, and I said, we've got to propose this to the community and to the NSF director and the National Science Board to have another project to essentially upgrade the entire infrastructure down there in the South Pole. We're calling it AIMS, which stands for Antarctic Infrastructure Modernization for Science. To really cut to the chase, luckily the NSF director agreed. The Science Board has been very enthusiastic. The final price tag on this is probably going to be between $400 to $500 million. And the reason I put a question mark, we haven't actually gotten it approved, but we are well along the line of getting this to happen. So much so that we're confident enough that we've been doing some modeling studies, really kind of a wind tunnel study. And what are we doing here? We're simply putting, and it's interesting, crushed walnut shells tend to be the best proxy for snow. Don't ask me why, it just works. And they blew the wind, the fan. You just see how snow would pile up on different ways that you lay out a new building structure. I mean, it's really the smart way to do it. So you want to make sure they're oriented right. You want to make sure that you're not doing it such that when the prevailing wind comes through, suddenly you get a 10-foot drift right in front of the entrance of a building. So this is what we've been doing, and it's worked really well. Too bad I won't be at NSF when it finally gets built, because I'm going to guess it's about a 7 to 8 year project. But I'll take a lot of pride in helping kickstart it going. I think usually when I talk to an audience of certainly PIs or principal investigators, they want to know a little bit of details about budgets. In fact, they usually like to know lots of details about budgets. So I'm going to try to go through this, not in gory detail, but show you the numbers, and then also try to show you, explain some of the background of what's going on and why we're where we are. And I'll start with 16, because 16 just got finalized just a couple months ago, a month or so ago. I'll also talk about the 17 request, because that's what we hope for next year. But let's start with 16. And I want to briefly go through a couple of things that we've highlighted as NSF-wide initiatives. One is there were only 2 NSF-wide initiatives, and that, what I mean by NSF-wide initiatives is all the directorates come together and we say, are there really compelling science directions that the foundation should go to? And really try to nudge the community in that direction. Before I go further, don't freak out on me, because some people say, oh, there we go, top-down management, you're telling us scientists where we should go. 90-something% of our funding in geosciences and the NSF across the board comes from just your great proposals coming in, and if it's a great idea, we'll fund it. But at about the 7 or 8% level, which isn't a lot, this is where this falls into, where we think we should put together a large package and sort of encourage the universities and other PIs to think about it. One is risk and resilience, and there's 2 components of that. One is what we call CRISP, and that's the engineering directorate and the geo directorate are leading this. And remember, there were only 2 new science initiatives, and this was one of them. And this was talking about the fact that we're in an age that's getting worse with time, where we have interdependent infrastructure. And by interdependent, when something goes down like the energy grid, it's not just the energy grid that goes down. So much else goes down. You can't go to the bank, you can't pump gas, everything goes down. And it turns out there's not a lot of understanding and really design studies about what's the best way to build a resilient infrastructure. So that's what engineering wanted to emphasize. And of course, natural disasters can impact this, but it's not just natural disasters. As you know, the grid could just go down for a lot of reasons, because it's not the most stable. The geo part was what I call prevents, and it was really focused on natural hazards. So this initiative for us was one that really is focused on earthquakes, volcanoes, tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, you name it, and really fund what I would call just basic fundamental understanding. We were also interested in the resilience part, and that's why I like the fact that prevents, the P starts with prediction because that's the basic science part. Then the R after that is the resilience part. Again, I'm not, other than these few bullets, and I just sort of described them to you briefly, I'm really excited about this, that there's going to be a solicitation coming and hitting the streets very soon. We did start with a Dear Colleague letter, so if you aren't aware of this, in September Geo released a Dear Colleague letter to talk a little bit about what you should expect and if you're interested in this, who you should contact. So I really highly recommend you Google this if you're interested in prevents. The solicitation, I hope, will come out in a couple months. If I were to show you just one slide about why should I care about natural disasters, I kind of like this slide. This slide was actually put together not by us, but by Munich Re. Munich Re, along with Swiss Re, I think you know this. These are reinsurance companies. And what's a reinsurance company? Remember, these are companies that insure the insurance companies. So they only care about major disasters to be done. That's all they care about. And so they follow them very carefully, and they have a database about major catastrophes. And for example, on the bottom, they've noted that there's been a very persistent rise in major catastrophes, however they define them. It may not be defined as scientists would, because what they're concerned about in major catastrophes is how much they're paying out, how many people are displaced, etc. Now, I'm not going to argue that this is just because of, for example, climate change, or that they're actually occurring more. That line's going up also because we're becoming more vulnerable as a society. For example, it's well known that more and more people are moving to the coast in droves. You move into the coast where you're going to be more vulnerable to hurricanes, for example. I could give you other examples. People are putting houses on faults. I wouldn't, but people are doing that. On the pie chart, it is kind of interesting in terms of this period from 1994 to 2013. What have been the costliest ones? It's all geo, except for a 6% wedge of terrorism. And no question, a big part of that must be 9/11. But that shows you how that fits in with everything else that is called a major disaster in the U.S. Turns out tornadoes, hurricanes, and tropical storms by far dominate it. But notice all the other things: wind, winter storms, and of course we just had a great example a couple weeks ago. So I just find this as a great illustrative slide of sort of why we need a prevents and why it's so important. And this is what I was just talking about. 2 feet of snow in DC is a disaster. And maybe I'll come down to this point. We don't know actually how much Winter Storm Jonas caused, and it really shut down the entire East Coast from DC to New York. But the last time something similar like that happened, it almost cost $4.6 billion in terms of the economy. And that is things we do have to sort of pay attention to, because sometimes people say, well, so what? Well, this is the so what in terms of why we have to be better at predicting and why we have to be better at resilience. And some people have also argued with the storm, weren't the predictions great, so why do we have to talk about them? Well, they were good for DC, actually. They weren't almost spot on, but some people have forgotten that for New York, the forecast is only for a couple inches of snow. In New York, if you were following news, got a couple feet of snow, so there's still a lot we have to do in this area about predictability. You don't shut down a major corridor like that for 5 days without having a major impact. This is the other, I said there were 2 initiatives, the new ones. This is the other one, also co-led by engineering and geo. So I was very busy my first year. We're basically calling it the Food Energy Water Nexus. We came up with a clever infuse, but really it's the Food Energy Water Nexus. And what we said, and what I feel very strongly about, is I think this is really the next grand challenge scientifically and also societal-wise. I've noticed some people going toward a water initiative. I noticed other people going toward an energy initiative. I feel very strongly that they're inseparable, and it really is at the nexus of these 3 things. You cannot separate food from water from energy. They're all very much interlinked. They very much depend on each other, and if you really want to understand what's going on, you have to do this as a kind of a coupled system. So this is what we're doing. Everywhere I've gone so far, and I'm going to guess you won't be an exception, but people have been very excited that we're pushing this particular initiative. And actually, a solicitation has already gone on in the street on this particular initiative. Again, if I were to show you one slide, just one, as to why you should care about food, energy, water, I think this sort of speaks for itself in terms of the population increasing. The real big one is that, again, people don't seem to understand very well, but it's happening maybe in other countries more than here, but it's happening here too, is massive migration to cities. And of course, the sort of demand increases on food, energy, and water. I mean, even if you think about it in a microcosm, the city alone has a huge challenge in terms of balancing this food, energy, water nexus. And understanding how they're going to provide all this for a population that keeps growing with time. As I mentioned, there's already a solicitation out there. I think it hit the street. The proposals are due in March. I think it hit the street in December. So hopefully I'm not giving you too late a deadline. I'm guessing if you were interested, you already were aware of this. A couple other things to note. I've been trying very hard to get other agencies to get involved. Why should I do that? Well, if I get other agencies involved, they will contribute funding, so the solicitation is even bigger in terms of the pot of money. NIFA, USDA is already committed, better not say because I'm not sure how much, but they've committed quite a bit of money to adding to our solicitation. I've had conversations with several other agencies to see if they will join our effort in this, and I've done that also with Prevents. And it really is so all of you can benefit from it. I figure that's one of my jobs. So let's talk a little bit about 16 now. First off, this was our budget request almost exactly 1 year ago. We were hoping with the President's request to get a 4.3% increase in the research and related account, basically the grants program. So you can also look at your PET directorate and see where Geosciences is. Geo was targeted, if we got the President's request, with 4.7% increase. It would have been great if we got this, but I just wanted to remind you this was the request that we had a year ago. I think you all know Representative Lamar Smith. He came up with America Competes, which is really what I want to talk about. Those were his co-sponsors for the bill. And this is one of the things he wrote when we were thinking about the 16 budget. They were the House Science Committee, which Representative Chairman Smith oversees, also was writing in parallel America Competes. And this is one of his statements: to remain competitive, we need to make sure our priorities are funded and the taxpayer dollars are spent wisely. So we need to fund innovative science and prioritize taxpayer investments in basic research without increasing spending. So this is what American Competes said, what his House Science Committee came up with. On the top left in red, it wasn't so bad. It actually asked for an increase of 3% for NSF. But what was less comfortable was the bottom red, in that they wanted to tell NSF exactly who they should fund. And where it really stands out is here. America Competes would have led to, depending on whether you want to look at our 15 budget or the 16 request, substantial decreases for Geo and really annihilating the social sciences. That's almost a 50% decrease in the social sciences directorate. By the way, education and human resources also was targeted for a huge decrease, 10%. But notice other directorates were given enormous plus-ups of order 10%, if not more. This is on the other committee that's really important. These are the guys that actually write the check, the House Appropriations Committee. What did they do? Well, they were not as generous in the top left. They said, we'll give you a 1% increase for NSF. But they had this kind of, I don't know what to call it, maybe a little screwy way of doing things. They said, we're going to group the biological sciences, the computer sciences, engineering, and NPS, and say they must take 70% of the budget of NSF and R&RA. And Geo and SBE gets the rest. Well, what does that mean? Well, I can't deconvolve what Geo and SBE would have gotten, but together that would have meant a 16 or 20% decrease, depending on, again, what number you want to use, the 15 budget or the 16 request. So both of these were not good. And of course, wouldn't have been good for Texas A&M because I know you guys depend so much on the geosciences budget. what I want to share with you is something I found really interesting. I don't want to share with you quotes from the geosciences community and the social sciences community, because I think you could sort of already predict what they would have said. I want to share with you what people said that had nothing to do with geosciences, or little to do, or less to do with geosciences and social sciences, because I think that's much more telling. So from AAAS, which of course part of AAAS is Geosciences, this is an excerpt. It has concerns about the approach to authorize NSF directorates individually, thus in effect placing certain directorates over others. The American Institute of Biological Sciences, you have to remember biosciences would have been plussed up a lot. But yet they wrote this: the committee was concerned that it specifies funding allocations for NSF research directorates. And then basically scientific advances occurs because you have flexibility to spend money across directorates. AAU wrote this. Basically, they were deeply concerned about the proposed cuts to basically SBE and Geosciences. And this is the one that I thought, this was the one that deeply impacted me in terms of, I thought this was a really kind thing to write from APS. APS, or American Physical Society, their discipline was probably going to get somewhere between a 10 or 12% increase. Yet they wrote this, that they think this is so detrimental to provide directorate-specific allocation, they far outweigh the benefits that basically they get. And that takes a lot for them to write something like that, especially when they're going to reap the benefits if this law passes. So, just wanted to share that. People don't tend to be, I know sometimes we think we sort of retract it into our disciplines and get very myopic, but here are good examples where people were thinking about for the good of the sciences in general, not about their specific discipline. So we finally got, what is it, 2 months ago? 2 months ago. This is what we finally got, 1.6% for all of NSF, but 1.7% for research and related. Again, not as much as we would have liked, but that was our final bottom line number. However, SBE was held flat. So Geo got out. We didn't get any directorate-specific allocation, but SBE got targeted. They were held level with 15. So I feel badly about that, but that's the way it turned out. I don't expect you to read the table, but I do. But I have enlarged for you on the right. What did other agencies do with the 16 budget? They do well? Well, comparatively speaking, we didn't do as well as a lot of the other agencies, and these are the numbers. Perhaps the only other one that was close to us was USGS at 1.63%. But NASA did really well, NOAA did well, NIH did very well. So in some respects it was a victory in that we largely avoided, for at least geosciences, the directorate-specific allocation. But we didn't really get, at a time when Congress decided to be rather generous to the sciences, NSF didn't really reap that benefit. And these numbers just tell it all. NIST, for example, got nearly a 12% increase. And later, if you want, you can look at the real fine numbers if you want to know. And this is how now it breaks out into the various divisions. All of them on order of 1%. It's not great. For all of Geo, it was 1.1, and for all the divisions, it was sort of similar. I will tell you, though, of all the directorates, we did get the largest dollar increase in 16. Not that it's a contest, but we get the largest dollar increase. I have to tell you a joke. I went up to, you shouldn't do this, but I went up to the staffers and there's a House Appropriations Committee, and I was talking about the budget. And I don't know why, I must have been feeling really kind of feisty, but I told the staffers, look, you don't want to hear what my priorities are. Just give me more money than the math and physical sciences group. They ended up laughing, so I guess I didn't shoot myself in the foot. I thought I'd share another thing with you, an interview with John Coberson. He is the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, again, the person that writes the check for NSF. I don't know if many people read this interview in the audience, but let me share several questions that were asked of him, because I think they're pretty telling. The NASA ended up well above the request, but not NSF. Did you have to make trade-offs. And look what he said. I pushed as hard as I could to get as much money for NSF. And I think they're very pleased with the increase. Of course we are. No matter how small it is. On the record, we're very pleased. And I remain committed to do the very best that I can do to make sure that NSF is fully funded. And remember that 70% rule where there were 4 directorates that said you get 70% of the funding and Geo and SB get the leftovers? He was asked, why did you remove that? You proposed that initially and then you didn't do it. And this was his response. There was strong opposition from other parts of Congress to that language. And with all legislation, you have to compromise. We made sure that the increase went to all the directors except for behavioral sciences. Except. Which we held flat. So this is in his own words. And this, I love this one. What message are you sending to NSF and the community with that stipulation? So they're telling the community, if you read what he says, that SB is not a hard science. I will remind you that's what they said Geosciences was not a hard science last year. So I suppose that's progress. We now, in fact, are a hard science. Although I don't know if I need to convince anybody in this room we're a hard science. But that's good. We're making progress. How about 17? This is what just came out, well, last week? God, I'm losing time. This is what came out last week. This is the 17 request. And again, it looks pretty decent. For RNRA, it's a 6.5% increase. For Geosciences, it'd be 6.1, but it's kind of similar to other directorates. But there is a nuance to this that not everybody in the community understands. The majority of this is in a new category called mandatory funding. And that's different. We tend to get funded out of what is called discretionary funding. And so there's 2 parts of this increase. One is the typical discretionary funding, and the other part is the mandatory funding. If I were to separate those out and tell you which part is discretionary, what part is mandatory, of the 6.5%, 1.3% is discretionary. So that's sort of the normal process we're thinking about. So where does this other 5.2% come from when it's mandatory? We put a slide together that all the directorates are showing. It is different. It is also known as direct spending. It's going to require a separate sort of budget authority approval to get it. It's not subject to discretionary caps because that's one of the reasons why we couldn't go over these caps. Congress produced these caps. And so this is basically a way to blow through the caps. I don't know a better way to say that. And it's only going to be one time. Another way to describe this, the closest thing I could relate this to is when we got the ARA funding. Everyone remember the ARA funding, that one-time infusion of funding? That's sort of what we're doing here. This would be one time only. It would be for the foundation about a 5-point-something% increase. So first question you might ask, even if you don't quite understand it, you do understand it's an increase, the first question you might ask is, what's the chances of this happening? Maybe the best way I could describe this is from a quote from Eddie Bernice Johnson, who's the ranking member on the House Science Committee. And I'll again let you just read this. This is sort of her take, and she's a pretty optimistic person. But rather than me say it, let me use her words as to how she describes it. Okay? And for our individual divisions within Geosciences, this is sort of the way it breaks out. 6.1% you already saw, and then how it would break out into divisions. Something else about the RCR, about the 17 request, the regional class research vessels are in that budget, and we don't anticipate any issues with that. So we are moving down the path of building 2 ships. And of course, Infuse and Risk and Resilience are in the budget too. Continued support actually for it. A few other topics and then I'll end because I'd like to see if there are any questions. For those who are interested in natural disasters, GEO did produce a series of, I think, 10 videos on different types of natural disasters, flooding, earthquakes, tornadoes, whatever. They were all videos that were hosted by Marshall Shepard. You may know him. He hosts the Weather Geeks on the Weather Channel. And I mention that because it's really great, I think, instructional video if you want to use it in your lectures. So this is the website, but you can just Google When Nature Strikes, you'll get it. And it's just free. You can just download them. So I just highly recommend. They're only a few minutes long. So if you are teaching a course where you want to use some illustrative examples or have some commentary or video on natural disasters, highly recommend you just go to this website and just download them. You'd make me very happy that our investment was a good one. Very briefly, I do want to hit on the fact that we're getting big on reliability, robustness, and reproducibility of science. It's gotten really huge press lately. Here are some samples of some of the articles that have been written about it. Some not so good about the fact that some experiments are not reproducible. Marcia McNutt has written about this too, and if you know Marcia McNutt, she's currently editor-in-chief of Science, but maybe more importantly, she's going to be the next president of the National Academy of Sciences starting July 1. And even on a further footnote about Marcia McNutt, I think it's a huge accomplishment and somewhat like bragging rights that they decided to choose a second geoscientist to follow Ralph Cicerone to head the National Academy. Because typically they choose different disciplines. They go back and forth between physical sciences and life sciences. So Ralph Cicerone is an atmospheric chemist. He's ending his tenure. And for whatever reason, I love it, we chose another geoscientist to head up the National Academy. But these are the ways she sort of says what she thinks are why we're in this predicament. More authors than ever. And maybe I'll ask this audience. When you have a paper that has 20 authors, do you think all 20 authors really understand the methodology and will sign off that I do understand exactly the experimental method that was done and I will say it was robust, etc. Competition is high. I think you know that. Number of papers, of course, as you know, the growth has been enormous. And how can you maintain quality? And she has this other interesting statement that increased impact, it no longer is just for our community. Much of what we write about in geosciences and other disciplines have much broader impact. And so the whole subject of reliability is important. And a real nice statement from Ralph Cicerone, the current president of the National Academy. Again, I'll let you read it, which I think sums it up very nicely about why we should be concerned about this subject. And of course, there are poster childs for why there's been a lot of public scrutiny. Cold fusion is probably one of them, but there's a lot of them out there where people have been very critical about results that were not replicable. I also know that it's discipline specific. I think we're sort of in the middle in geosciences. I think on the high end are clinical studies. I mean, that's the epitome of kind of being able to reproduce, because otherwise it's not going to go to market. I was educated by my colleague in the engineering directorate. So he said largely this isn't an issue. And I said, really? It's not an issue in engineering directorate? And I said, why? It's because really for us the test is the market. And if you can't replicate, you're just on a business. So he says the market forces take over in the engineering director. He won't argue that it's zero, but that helps keep it under control. So there's a wide spectrum from clinical studies to say maybe the engineering director. One other thing I want to talk about, because we just announced this as being effective last month, was essentially making sure your publications are posted on a website if you're funded from NSF. Actually, all the agencies are asking this, but this is for NSF. And so we do have a repository. It is called Pages, right? I think it's called Pages. Where after you, at the end of your award period, you have to show that you've actually uploaded your publication to a website that's for open access. So a lot of PIs don't know that, but it is now required. The one thing that was also requested of all agencies was for open access for all data. All I'm saying here is we've kind of asked for a delay on that. because as much as I think publication is a tractable problem of uploading it to a site, data is just an order of magnitude different problem. And so to truly have an open access for all data, so that's really available and all the metadata, et cetera, are available, we think this is non-trivial, and we want to do it right versus hurry it and do something that's clunky and that everyone's going to hate. So all I'm saying here is we're still talking about it. Which is probably what you want me to say, because it's going to be a lot of work for you if you have responsibility to upload your data to a site. And I think this is the last thing. And this may be mostly for people like in the drilling program. I think you must be aware, if you're not, that NSF asked the National Academy of Public Administration, NAPA, to do a study on the use of cooperative agreements in support of large infrastructure. And NSF and other agencies use cooperative agreements all the time. I mean, basically, there are two mechanisms. You have a contract, or a slightly more flexible mechanism is a cooperative agreement, which NSF really likes. So many of us were nervous about this in terms of what it was going to say. So I'm going to show you two bullets. One, we all breathed a sigh of relief that said that NAPA said, we're okay with cooperative agreements. In fact, we don't see any benefit from cooperative agreements over contracts. And why that was music to our ears is because of our Office of Inspector General, the person that always, the Inspector General is always looking for things that you can correct or things you're doing wrong. The Inspector General wanted us to change everything to contracts. And we thought at the foundation that never happened, never been in the night. It's easy to audit, which is where they're coming from, but it's not easy to manage. So we like that. This is the one that we're nervous about, and we haven't responded to. All cooperative agreements have a management fee. In other words, that little bit of money you get for taking on the cooperative agreement. And a lot of people that oversee cooperative agreements, they desperately need that management fee. This report recommends we abolish them, zero amount. And we're uncomfortable about that recommendation. And everyone that oversees a facility that has a cooperative agreement should be a little nervous about this, but we haven't responded to this yet, and I can't tell you what we're going to say about it. We're thinking about it. I just had a meeting a couple days ago with the director to talk about this. So this is a big, big deal, and I wanted to share that with you. And then the NSF building, and that's it. That's what it looks like, really looks like. I don't know if you know, we're moving. Summer 17 is roughly when we're going to move into this new building. And there's where we are now, kind of west of the wall. This is where we're going. We should go to Reagan Airport. It's going to be very easy. It's 3 metro stops down on the yellow line in Alexandria. It's the Eisenhower stop. So if you didn't know we were moving, and for those who go to panels and everything else, it's not too far away. It's a little over a year we're going to be moving into a new building. So there. Hopefully there's some questions that you can ask. And I do apologize if I didn't hit your particular subject. There's so much going on in the foundation. It's really hard to pick the right subjects.
So we probably have about 5 or 8 minutes for questions.
I was just going to say, you mentioned the cooperative agreements. There's been a shift to actually collaborative agreements now, which is, of course, quite different than cooperative.
No, NSF is very committed to cooperative agreements. We're going to stay on that. And in fact, I don't think this NAPA report even mentioned that we should even think about collaborative agreements. We think cooperative agreements have worked very effectively.
Can you say anything more about this whole data management problem? There's going to be costs associated with making data available. Is there any thinking about what long-term?
Well, let me back up. I do get it why we want to do this, because we need data to be available.
Right.
And I would argue, more importantly, to make data available to what I call the choir, which is like you and me. I think we need data available to other people that would not normally get this data. And maybe, I've said this before, the poster child for this worked really well is with NOAA. Because NOAA made their data pretty much open access. That led to $1 billion private weather industry. Right? And so, I mean, that's great. And it didn't hurt NOAA at all. In fact, it benefited NOAA. I get it where it's really important that we get data out there, but to say that and to do it are two different things. One is the cost, and one is, for example, a PI that oversees a vast data set, how they're going to do it. In big science projects like telescopes and field projects, it's usually not a problem because there usually is a central repository. I'm more concerned about the single PI and the overhead that's going to be required. And think about what we call gray data. I mean, these sort of things that are on strip charts. My colleague in the biological sciences directorate says, once I say the word, you'll get it. He says, we got all these bug boxes. You know, what are we going to do? You can't scan those in. And yet they consider those really valuable resources. What do you do that? How do you upload that in a permanent way? And there are millions of them all over the place. So this is what I worry about, both sort of the overhead and just managing this. I mean, some of these are not tractable. And I think we're going to have to narrow it down to parts that are tractable. And it's going to be expensive. We figured that if we had to build our own central repository for this, it cost the same amount as funding NSF. We really wanted to do a good job. Yeah.
Could you say something about the role of long-term measurement sites?
Well, what do you want me to say?
I want you to address balancing those versus single PI proposals. How do you deal with that? Using long-term measurement.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand. Long-term observations or say long-term facilities?
Yeah.
Yes, yes?
Yes, please.
I think you need both. And for example, with, let me just pick on Ocean Sciences because Rick is here. Their budget is roughly 50-50 in terms of the major facilities, but they're still protecting 50% for sort of the single PI, maybe a couple PIs coming together. Otherwise, and that's why we did this National Academy study. The complaint was the infrastructure was going to overwhelm the entire grants program. The Academy study said stop. I have been very, very cognizant of this across all of GEO, and even with flat budgets, we've sort of stabilized at about 45%, which means reductions in infrastructure or long-term facility investments. Now, that's been a little bit of pain, but if we don't do that, it's going to suddenly jump to 60-70%, and then you're left with 30% of the pie for a single PI. So it is very important. We have to strike a balance, and it may mean hard choices where we, unfortunately, have to decide that some facilities, just because they're antiquated or whatever, we can't operate them. I hope we don't get to that point, but if we have continual flat budgets, we're going to have some hard choices coming up. Does that help?
Can I just elaborate on that one quick point? Is that in addition to the big scale dollars that Roger was talking about in terms of infrastructure versus science, it's important to remember that so-called big science is often composed of bunches of individual PIs. And you look in ocean sciences with the IODP or the research fleet, as you'll see tomorrow, is about $80 million out of my budget. But that research fleet, dozens, if not hundreds of scientists go out on the research fleet every year, funded from the science side of things. And it's the same not only in OCE or other aspects of Roger's directorate in terms of like EAR, but also telescopes and MPS, and a lot of individual PIs go out and work on them. So it's not so simple as saying, okay, we've got the big science versus small science. It's kind of how the big science helps the small science in that overall architecture of the large balance of dollars between supporting the steel and supporting the grants. So it kind of goes both ways.
Yeah, no, maybe if I could add one other part, because you really had a part two in your question was long-term observations. I will say that it's not a big part of our budget, but one of the culture changes that have occurred at NSF is being more open to long-term observations. In the past, NSF hasn't done it because they considered it monitoring. And NSF doesn't do monitoring, that's for NOAA and NASA. But if you notice LTER, the Long-Term Ecological Network, and there are other networks where essentially there are long-term observations. NSF has been more open to that, as long as you can prove that it's still advancing basic research. And that's a culture change, actually.
Yeah, that's huge, actually.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge. Yeah.
Are there any changes coming down the pike in terms of the prioritization of the career award program?
Okay, I love these softball questions. I will tell you that career is being examined right now. which I think is a good thing. I don't ever think any program at NSF should be considered an entitlement. But after that examination, we may do nothing with career, but we may also tweak it. So that's a fair statement. The reason why I don't want to say much more than that is because we're still looking. The career is, along with other things, we will examine.
One more question?
I'm interested in your point about the reproducibility
Yes.
of research being so important, and how support for studies, those kinds of studies, goes along with NSF's sort of emphasis on state-of-the-art transformational research, which
Yeah.
I don't really relate with the sort of reproducibility.
Right, and that's really a question we've gotten from a lot of people. I think we've pushed that button so much that people say, well then, why would NSF even fund a reproducibility study? And I think we have to realize that a fraction, not a big fraction, but part of it needs to do that. I'll give you just a great example. Climate is under a lot of scrutiny, and it begs for reproducibility and reliability studies, and I think NSF needs to step up to the plate and fund some of those studies. I think there's some more fundamental problems with sort of climate to maintain that train of thought, is that we're talking about millions of lines of codes that maybe only have a lifetime of a couple years, because once the platform changes, you can't run that code anymore. So by default, it's not reproducible. Because even if you got the code to run on the next platform, you're probably going to get a slightly different answer, because that's just the way it works in the computer world. So I'm more worried about that sort of problem. But I think we're thinking very much about sending out a Dear Colleague letter that, in fact, I won't speak for other directors, that actually says that even if it's just reproducibility, if you can convince the program officers and maybe a couple reviewers that it's worth doing and doesn't quite fit under transformative research, that we will still fund it because we think the subject is so important. So thank you for asking for that.
All right, well, thank you, Roger. And